I expected that. We should have provided blankets and bovril and all the rest of it. And thank you for the invitation to come and speak. I'm a little hesitant about speaking about this. I did give you two titles, didn't I? And you went for this one. And I'm hesitant about this because, first of all, talking about yourself is something I'm not terribly good at doing. Because the temptation is you kind of wallow in stories that you think are interesting and no one else thinks are interesting. And so what I thought I'd do is keep the focus on what it means to be particularly a first-generation scholar, and what that might mean, not just for first-generation scholars, but for all of us as an academic community, if that's all right. And I'm going to come back at the end of this talk to 5 themes which have been important for me. And that's something about what I mean by vocation, something about what it means to accept who you are, something about patience, something about work-life balance, and something about community, okay? But I'm not going to structure a talk in terms of, those 5 points. I'm going to tell you a story, which I'm afraid is about my own life. I hope that's all right. And then if we've got time for question and answer, and actually you're not frozen to the bone, then you can ask me certain things about it. Am I okay, everyone? So let me start in a wonderful place called Anfield Plain, where I grew up. Anfield Plain is not really famous for anything. It's the birthplace of Alan Armstrong, an actor who you might have seen on various television series. And the second thing Anfield Plain was most significant for was when I was at junior school, a new superstore was opened in Anfield Plain. It was a co-op superstore. And it was opened in the 1970s by the then Miss England, in the days when you had beauty contests. And Miss England was the person who came to open this supermarket. And this was so significant to Anfield Plain that we were given the day off school to attend the opening of this new supermarket with Miss England. And we went with autograph books to get the autograph of Miss England. Now that's Anfield Plain for you. And this is the infant school to the left, where I started. I won't say it's rough Anfield Plain, but after my first day as a 4-year-old, I came home with a black eye, having been headbutted by a 5-year-old girl. And so I arrived back at the end of school on my first day with a black eye. Now, she said it was an accident. I'm not too sure myself. And I think my mum was so actually in Northeast, that's my mam, was so upset about this that she became one of the dinner ladies at Anfield Plain Infant School. So she was one of the women who kind of served the meals and supervised or tried to stop girls headbutting 4-year-olds in the playground afterwards. That's my junior school, where I was raised to the very important role of milk monitor. This was every morning, 11 o'clock, that the dairy would deliver bottles of milk, and my job was to distribute the bottles of milk. This was before Mrs. Thatcher abolished them, but that was the only kind of role that I had at my junior school. And Anfield Plain was an ex-mining village. Some of this will help you a little bit, I hope, about the Northeast. Lots of pit villages had grown up in the Northeast, and Anfield Plain was one of them. This was the Morrison Busty pit, which was just outside Anfield Plain, where most people who lived in Anfield Plain would have some connection to. My uncle worked there the whole of his working life. My father started down the mine at the age of 14 as a pit electrician, so an apprentice electrician. Mining was an awful business, dangerous, dirty. I mean, one of the hardest jobs, I think, that I've ever kind of heard about. And my father, after a couple of years, continued as an electrician down the pit, but went to night school, where he began to train as an electrical engineer. None of the family had ever been to university. He didn't go to university. He did all of his electrical qualifications in his spare time, and eventually went on to work for the Northeastern Electricity Board. And if you drive around Northumberland and see these electricity pylons, that's my dad who put them there. As you can see from this, he was a very good engineer, but had no aesthetic sense at all. And so you get electricity pylons here, there, and everywhere, just messing up the countryside, because it was the most efficient way to convey electricity. So my mum was a dinner lady at the local school. My dad was working for the electricity board, and a number of things about childhood were important. They'll come out later in the story. This was the Methodist chapel that my parents went to, and I was dragged along to. Particularly, I resented it greatly because Thunderbirds was always on a Sunday, and I had to miss Thunderbirds. This was the day before video recorders. Can you even believe how old I am on that? And the front of the chapel in Anfield Plain was very interesting. This is what was called a primitive Methodist chapel. Primitive Methodists were a brand of Methodists who were very skeptical about clergy. They didn't like the authority of church leaders. And they were very skeptical about what they used to call popery. Not the little things that you have in your lounges, but anything to do with Roman Catholicism and candles and bells and smells and all the rest of it. And at the front of Anfield Plain Methodist Church was a very, very small communion table. Not an altar, just a little table. On it was a very small cross. But the thing that dominated the whole of the front of Anfield Plain Methodist Church was this. It was a banner from the local branch of the National Union of Mine Workers. This was a huge banner at the front of the church. The NUM, National Union of Mine Workers, had developed in the 60s and 70s out of a number of smaller unions. It would reach its fame with Arthur Scargill and the miners' strikes in the mid-1980s. But for me as a child growing up, this was a fascinating thing to see at the front of a church. And to be honest, I was more fascinated often in the pictures on this banner than I was by the sermons that I had to sit through. And it's a picture from the book of Isaiah, where the lion lays down with the lamb. And the subtitle, which you can't see there, is The Reign of Peace. And every year in the Northeast, and it still happens, although often it's outside of term, the communities that used to make up these mining villages, with these great banners representing their pit or their local lodge of the NUM, come into Durham for a big day, where with brass bands and flags, they parade around the city. Normally, someone from the Labour Party speaks on the racecourse, and then everyone has an occasional drink at the end of the day. It's a very colourful thing. But for me, as a kid, I grew up in staunchly old Labour community that had a deep impression on me. The houses in Anfield Plain were largely terraced. This is the street that I grew up in more recently, so you can see that doors and windows have been renewed. But this was terraced houses, and I don't want to become overly romantic about this, but very few people locked their doors. You just wandered in from house to house. It was a very kind of small community. Often children would buy houses in the same street as parents, so that the community was very tight-knit. That meant that as a kid, if you did something wrong, it was known immediately throughout Anfield Plain. There was an Anfield Plain in secondary school, and this was my secondary school. This is Greencroft Comprehensive. Now, I have to tell you this, that at the age of 10, my parents, who believed very strongly in education, although they'd never been to university, decided that it would be really good for me to go to a private school. They couldn't quite afford that, so they wanted me to sit an entrance exam in order to get a bursary, financial support to do that. And they wanted to send me to either the Royal Grammar School here in Newcastle or Dame Allen's in Newcastle. And at the age of 10, I refused on political grounds. This was a very clear decision that I took. Now, those of you who went to private school, forgive me, I'm not making a judgment here. I just have to testify that I turned down going to private school on political grounds because of my political views at the age of 10. I've mellowed just a little bit since then, but you can see the kind of background that I grew up in. And here at Greencroft Comprehensive School, this was a rough place as well, to be honest, but it was fine. It started off as a grammar school, and then was turned into a comprehensive school and became a much better school. And I had a number of good teachers. I had a really crazy physics teacher who believed that the only things that children would ever remember were the things that they saw on television. And so when he came to important parts of the physics O-level curriculum, he had a hollowed out television, and he would put the television on top of his head, and he'd speak out of the screen to say, you need to remember this. I had a really good chemistry teacher who was, who lived here in Durham and commuted out to teach here. She was very good. And I had a really terrifying maths teacher. I was terrible at languages. I wasn't terribly good at English, but I could do maths. And so I did maths, physics, and chemistry at A level. Thought to myself, where do I go to from here? Because out of this school, only 3 of us would go to university. Now this was a very different world to the one that you've grown up in. This was partly because every student was fully funded in those days, and so the numbers were quite small. Only 3 of us would go to university, so the school wasn't kind of set up for you to go to university. And I did wonder about whether it was right for me to go to university or not. But a couple of things happened. I just wanted to show that my school no longer exists. It was dragged down for a health hazard, and that's where I used to do German, and that's where I used to do mathematics. But anyway, move on. Jamie will know a little bit about this, but this was now the late 70s, early 80s. And Anfield Plain is just down the road from Concert. And Concert in those days had a huge steelworks. Northeast was built on 3 main industries: steelworking, shipbuilding, and coal mining. So you got the coal in order to get the energy for the steelworks. The steelworks would produce steel for shipbuilding. You have this kind of virtuous circle. And all 3 of those major industries had come to the end of their lives, effectively. because overseas was producing these things much cheaper. And in a very brutal period of time under Margaret Thatcher's leadership of the Conservative Party, partly because she realised rightly that these industries had come to the end of their lives, but partly because the unions in these industries were very strong. She really demolished these three areas of northeastern manufacturing. And Consett was a place where there was a huge steelworks, and the town was red-brown. Streets, houses, sometimes even people, because of the pollution from the steelworks. And most of my friends at secondary school would go to work either in the steelworks or in some industry related to it. And then the steelworks was closed down when I was 17. And this led to a period of huge unemployment for the region. One of the mistakes, I think, that the Tory government at that time made was not perhaps closing the industries, but not thinking about what other industries could be brought into a region. Norman Tebbit, a Tory politician, kind of famously said, well, people can get on their bike and go down to London and find jobs there. But that misunderstood the nature of communities and the nature of people wanting to stay together. And a lot of the friends that I went to school with were unemployed for between 5 to 10 years or so before new industries started to come in. And the Northeast today is a slightly more balanced economy with big manufacturing, with Nissan and Sunderland, things of that sort. But at this stage, it was really not too good. The second thing that made me think about university was the wonderful game of cricket, because this was one of my big loves. I wasn't bad at mathematics, but I could play cricket pretty well. I know the way I am today doesn't suggest a kind of lithe fielder or fast bowler, and I could never bowl, but I could bat pretty well. And I played in the Tyneside Senior League. This is the Anfield Playing Ground, which is one of the kind of real beauty spots of Anfield play. And I made a few runs on that ground, and I thought, maybe I could go to university, and I'm pretty good at mathematics. So maybe I can get through a university degree with not too much work, giving a lot of time for the really important part, which is cricket. And that's what I thought. And so I went to Oxford University and offered myself as a candidate for their undergraduate program. They cruelly turned me down and said, you're not good enough. And they were quite right, actually. I just wouldn't have been able to cope with the intensity of Oxbridge. But my chemistry teacher, who came from Durham, said to me, oh, Durham's pretty good at cricket, you know. I said, I know that. She said, I've got a friend in the physics department. Do you want to go and speak to him about maybe coming to Durham? I said, well, I don't want to stay local. I mean, that's really naff, isn't it? I mean, you know, you've got to go away to university. Well, I came through and I talked to Brian Tanner in the physics department, who was very kind. And actually, I started to think, hey, I can play cricket here and I can do physics. That wouldn't be too bad. I have to say to you that my cricket career never developed. I mean, I actually thought I was better than I was. I played a lot of college cricket, but I didn't play for the university team. I didn't have that first-class career that I thought I really deserved. But what happened was that while I was here, I got into physics. But just before that, another confession, second confession of the night. I went to Grey College. I didn't go to John's. This is really terrible, isn't it? And Grey in those days was an all-male college, and it smelt. I mean, really, really smelled badly. In fact, after the first 2 or 3 weeks of being a fresher, all of your clothes smelt of Grey College. And in fact, if you went around the university, people would come up to you and say, "You're from Grey, aren't you? I can smell you." Now, it was reputed either a lad called Phil Mackey, it was his socks, or it was the cleaning fluid used in Grey. It was one or the other. But it was an all-male college. It was so Grey was all male, Trevs was all female. That was our kind of linked college. It was really awkward at times, particularly when Grey had its summer ball, because they always would sell double tickets, which meant that you desperately had to go over to Trevs and find someone to go to the ball with you. And Trevs also sold double tickets. I mean, it was just awful. Anyway, I went to Grey, and partly because it was easier to get in, I think, at that stage. And I found it a really odd culture. I remember the first formal where we had to wear gowns. And I thought, how bizarre is this? And I had no idea how to put a gown on. I then dipped my gown the sleeve of the gown immediately into the gravy and spread it all over the table. There were vegetables on the table that I'd never seen before. I didn't know how to ask for them, apart from, can you pass the green stuff over? Thanks. And Grey also, in those days, used to have food fights. So, first formal, I'd be sitting there, I got hit on the head by a roast potato. I mean, this was serious stuff in those days. And I thought, what on earth have I come to? This is a long way from Anfield Plain, even though it's only kind of 20 minutes by car. And there was something actually about Durham, about culturally being very different, that was both a challenge and a joy, actually. It took me into a different world. One of the things one or two things helped me in this. One of the things that really helped me was the Christian Union through all of these years. And I know different of you will have different views of the CU, but what I found in the CU was a common ground where Christian faith went across different divides. We were all from different places. I found that in cricket as well, and other sports. And so there's something about going beyond the kind of the life of Grey, which was largely based on a bar culture, and it was very private school dominated in those days. But I found across the university different groups really helped me to develop. And then I arrived in the physics department. And this was the physics department without those new buildings of the Ogden Centre. Have you walked by on South Road, Daniel Liebeskind place. And funnily enough, although I'd arrived to do cricket, what I found was that physics began to be actually quite interesting. Because the first two courses in first year physics were relativity and quantum theory. Those were the first two courses. I mean, none of this rubbish about, trying to fix electrical circuits or rolling wooden trolleys down benches that you do at GCSE or whatever it is. I mean, straight into the big stuff. And relativity was taught by Arnold Wolfendale, who was then the professor, who was just a complete character. And quantum theory was taught by Alan Martin, who, there was a lecture full of 250 people. And for 22 lectures, at the end of every lecture, he would say, "Any questions?" And he would pause. And in 22 lectures, there was never one question ever raised by a first-year undergraduate on quantum theory. You can't blame people for that. But I got into it. I started to really get into it. And some of the people who helped me during that time, to the top left, top right, yours, is George Rochester. Some of you will know that the building is now named after him. And George was an elf-like figure around the department. He was the emeritus professor of physics. He retired. He discovered in the 1950s something called the strange particle, which I haven't got time to go into, but he should have been given the Nobel Prize and never was. And George had retired, but he went to the same church that I went to in Durham. And he would invite students around for dinner on a Sunday, which was great. I mean, he was a great theoretical physicist. He was absolutely terrible at carving a chicken. And during the meal, he would keep saying, and David, of course, as you know, and I had no idea what was going on about, but he was a really good friend. And one of the things about Durham Physics was, in my first year, because I've not done the scale of mathematics that others have done, I barely scraped through. I scraped through by 1% on my first year exams. Just got through. And one of the things I discovered about myself was that actually I was a late developer. So I wasn't as bright at the age of 17 as later on. And some people's kind of arc goes like that. Some people's arc goes like that. Some people's arc goes like that. For me, some of this stuff didn't make sense at all until 2 months before my finals, when suddenly it started to click. For the first 2 years, it was a real struggle. I mean, that might be related to the amount of time I was playing cricket, or maybe not. But for me, it's often kind of been, I'm a late developer in terms of how I am. And I did okay at the end of the degree, and then Arnold Wolfendale, who's here to the left, who was head of physics, said, why don't you come and do a PhD with me? And I said, well, I'm partly interested in particle physics. Maybe I should go to Oxford and Cambridge. And Oxford offered me a place. I was really pleased about that because they'd rejected me 3 years previously. And Arnold said, come and do something on astrophysics, he said. I know you're a Christian, he said, and some of the theological questions will be bigger than in astrophysics than they are in particle physics. And he was very persuasive. And so I started a PhD with Arnold Wolfendale, and I'll tell you something about that in a moment. But Arnold was a very important person. He was Astronomer Royal. He was on that committee. So he didn't directly supervise me. He gave to me one of his young postdocs. This is Naraya Chandra Rana, who was on leave in Durham from Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Bombay. A brilliant young Indian physicist. And Arnold said, Rana, will you look after this naive young research student? And he and I became great friends. He was very small, and he had a very dodgy pacemaker, so that he couldn't walk upstairs. So as we walked along around the department or at conferences, as we came to stairs, I would just pick him up quite naturally, walk up the stairs and put him down, and we'd continue our conversation. And most remarkable physicist, unfortunately died a few years ago, and I've just done an article for an Indian publication which is devoted to his memory. He'd worked on cosmology and the origin of the universe, and he and I started to do a bit of work on one or two issues which we thought were interesting. And that was interesting in terms of PhD supervision. Wolfendale just said, go off and find something interesting to do. And what was interesting, first of all, was something called star formation. Now, you might have seen some of the images from the James Webb, the new telescope. This is one of them. And this is a region in Orion where you see here clouds of hydrogen starting to form stars. These are maternity hospitals for stars. And this is the most recent one that was published just a couple of days ago from one of our small neighboring galaxies called the Small Magellanic Cloud. And what James Webb does is it looks at the sky not with optical light, but with infrared light, which means you can see through some of the dust. And some of these regions, the very bright regions, are where new stars are being formed. And this region will eventually form about 10,000 stars or so. And stars are formed, we discovered, out of clouds of molecular hydrogen, not atomic hydrogen. I can see you're all interested in this, but molecular hydrogen. And what we were interested in was how the number of stars being formed affects how galaxies evolve. Because when you look out into the sky and you look at galaxies, you look at them back in time. You see them as they were when the light. So you've got a kind of test of how galaxies evolve. But can you actually understand a theoretical model? So what you need to do is relate the number of stars being formed to the amount of molecular hydrogen in the galaxy. And this was the big difficulty, because molecular hydrogen would be really at home in the Leech Hall tonight. It's very cold, which means it doesn't radiate stuff that you can see. But fortunately, in these big clouds, there's a bit of carbon monoxide, and carbon monoxide is very busy radiating stuff. And so you can look at our galaxy, and this is our Milky Way galaxy, and this is the amount of carbon monoxide radiation in our galaxy, and that tells you where the molecular hydrogen is. You notice that it's in this very defined plane of our galaxy. This is looking at our galaxy side on. If you look down on it, it would look like a spiral pattern. And what we were able to begin to do was think about how the amount of hydrogen that you see here can be related to the amount of stars that form over time. And that tells you how a galaxy evolves. And we were fortunate to be able to publish quite a few papers during the first year of my PhD. This is really unusual. And in fact, by the end of the first year of PhD, we'd been so lucky to stumble on this theoretical equation, a law of star formation, that by the end of the first year of my PhD, I had enough to write up a thesis. So I went to Wolfendale and said, Professor Wolfendale, I think I can write up now. Now, Wolfendale had got funding for me for 3 years. And so he said, oh, I don't think you have. And for the next 2 years, he just gave me problem after problem after problem to look at out of what he was interested in. Which meant that by the time I got to my thesis, it was around about 400 pages long. And the first thing that the external examiner said to me, the PhD viva, was, this is 3 to 4 times the size of a typical PhD. What on earth have you been doing? To which I kind of just looked at my supervisor and said, it's his fault. So I mean, you can do that in theoretical physics. Sometimes you get a little lucky. And so we then went on to questions about the solar neutrino problem, which is the amount of neutrinos, particle produced in the right inside the sun. Millions of them are going through your body just at the moment. And there was a problem with the measurements of how many neutrinos come from the sun compared to theoretical models. So we did a bit on that. And then we wandered off to discover or try and think out how the dinosaurs were wiped out. And this is an interesting thing, because most people in Hollywood and in popular science say, well, basically a big comet hit the Earth, and that's why the dinosaurs died out. Then the question is, how did a big comet hit the Earth? So hold that, and then the second question was that if you look at the terrestrial record, every 30 million years or so, there's a big extinction. Okay, so the dinosaurs aren't the only one, the KT boundary, there are a whole number of others. And a number of people had said, oh, they said 30 million years, they said. It's interesting, isn't it? I don't know if you can see this. But as our solar system goes round our galaxy, it oscillates up and down through the plane of the galaxy. And that cyclicity is 30 million years. They said. Maybe every time the solar system goes through the plane of the galaxy, maybe these big clouds of hydrogen knock a few comets into the inner solar system, and you get an extinction. And what Mark Bailey and Wolfendale and I think, showed was that actually that can't happen, because there's just not enough molecular clouds to make it happen. So the other extinctions must have been caused by something else. And we suggested that the other extinctions might be eruptions. But if the other extinctions are caused by volcanic eruptions, maybe the dinosaur extinction was caused by that as well. But my best guess is that the dinosaurs were just really unlucky and got hit both by a volcanic scale of volcanic eruptions and a comet at the same time. So that was some of the physics that I did. And then, is this all right so far, by the way? Is this okay? And then I felt at the age, mid-20s, I'd done quite a bit of science, and the option was for me to go to the States and continue doing it. But I'd had a feeling for a number of years that actually that wasn't what I was completely about. Now, at this point, I would use the language of, I felt the leading of God. And that was to become a Christian leader rather than just devote the whole of my life to science. And so I went to the Methodist Church and said, do you think I could be a leader in the Methodist Church? And to my complete surprise, they said yes, but you need some training. And they sent me to this place called Wesley House in Cambridge, which was a nightmare for me. I'd just done my PhD in science. I came to a place where, after 3 lectures of pastoral theology, I was asked to leave the class because I was too disruptive. You see, I was used to just asking questions. That was the way that I'd learned. But the lecturer couldn't cope with me. He thought that you just had to sit there and listen to the wisdom that was being given. And so I was thrown out of one class. Some of the other lectures were really terrible. I mean, really bad. I mean, there was a lecture series on the Psalms where the first lecture there were 40 of us. In the second lecture, that number had gone down to 5. There's then a moral dilemma, which is, do you take the moment then not to go to the third lecture? Or do you try and help the lecturer out by going along? So I made the mistake of going to the third lecture of this 20-lecture course to find that there were only 2 of us at the third lecture, by which time the lecturer knew who I was. And therefore, I didn't feel that I could leave anymore. So I had to sit through these. I mean, they were terrible, really, really bad. But the saving grace for me was this guy. This was John Polkinghorne. And Polkinghorne had been chair of particle physics, theoretical physics at the Cavendish in Cambridge, and then had trained for the Anglican ministry. And he'd just come back as Dean of Trinity Hall. And he was lecturing in the Department of Theology on science and theology. And he was very kind to me, and because I was a fellow physicist. And he spoke in a language that I understood. And he also used pictures. At that stage, most theologians didn't use pictures at all. I was a scientist. I was used to pictures. Science as a whole is based on pictures. So if you go to a scientific conference, you'll see physicists going like this. They're kind of describing graphs and things of that sort. In theology, people would come into a room with a script and just stand there and read for a whole hour on Psalms. I mean, that was, anyway, Paul Cullen didn't do that. And so I did some work with John. For those of you who are doing dissertations at the moment, let me encourage you. He supervised my third year dissertation on science and theology, which he was very happy about. It was then marked by another member of the department, and I got a 2-2 on the dissertation. That dissertation has subsequently been published in 5 different languages. So please don't trust sometimes the marks that you get within the sciences. You can trust in science, within theology. I then, after 3 years of theology, I still didn't think I was cut out for this academic life. And so I went off to lead a church, which I did for about 10 years in Liverpool. And just round the corner here is Penny Lane. I used to get my hair cut in the barber shop on Penny Lane. Most of our church swore blindly that they'd either gone out with or were related to Paul or John of the Beatles. And this was an interesting church. I arrived to find that the windows were bulletproof glass. This was inner city Liverpool, but actually not as bad as people thought. And the reason that I got to this church, right out of college, was because I was the only person left to look after it. I found later that 13 other people had turned it down, partly because they didn't want to live in inner city Liverpool. I loved it. It was just fantastic. I mean, we had a number of things stolen and all the rest of it, as you might imagine, in the inner city. But it was the kind of place which was really helpful to form me as a person. The people were great. They said what they thought, didn't mess around, but ultimately they valued me. And we stayed there 10 years, and we got married there, and had our 2 kids there. I thought I'd show you my family, if that's all right, I'm really proud of them. This is Alison on a wedding day, to me, by the way. This is her now. This is my daughter, Hannah, to the left, and this is Adam and his wife, Rachel, to the right. And I think in terms of becoming principal of a college, I can't underestimate just how supportive and sacrificial they've been to allow me to do this. Because most jobs don't involve you giving a talk at 8 o'clock in a freezing cold Leech Hall. Some do. But as you might imagine, the kind of demands upon a principal of a college means that you don't get to see as much of your family as in typical jobs. And I couldn't have done any of this without their support through it. And then it brings me to this place, which for the past 16 years has been the most wonderful doorway into a life that I never imagined. So I came back to Durham because the work that I was doing in the local church had grown, and the kind of interest nationally that people had in science and theology had grown. And I just found it was difficult to look after a church community and do some of the work of broadcasting and writing and speaking that was kind of piling up in my diary. And David Day, the principal then of John's, said, David, if you write your own job description to come back to Durham, I'll find the money for you to come back. And how often do you get something like that? What a gift that was. So I came back to a job which was based both at John's and the department. And I mean, that period of time was a real gift. I found myself working full-time as an academic, particularly in the theology department, for 3 years, and thought, this isn't quite for me. I enjoy teaching with students, but it's not all that I am. And the job for John's came up, and 1 or 2 people said, would you apply? And I said,
it's not really me. I mean, it's a bit Anglican for me, is John. So anyway, I'm a Greyman, you know, I am. So I applied, and I mean, it was, you know, it was not many candidates applied, let's be, so they were stuck with me. But they made the mistake that they hadn't checked the Constitution. And the Constitution of St. John's in those days said you had to be an Anglican to be appointed as principal. And they got to the stage almost offering me the job, and then realized, oh, he's not an Anglican, he's a Methodist. He's a really odd Methodist. He doesn't get dressed up in cassocks and dog collars and things of that sort. And so there was an interesting conversation with one of the members of council about whether I would convert to Anglicanism in order to be appointed as principal of John's, to which I said no. And eventually what they had to do was suspend the Constitution, appoint me, and then reinstate the Constitution, which was a big risk for John's to do. But John's has always taken risks. You realise that. Ruth Etchells was the first female principal of a mixed college in Durham. She was the first lay female principal of a theological college in the UK. John's has always taken those kind of risks. And what I found here was an enormous heart of community, of students and staff. And I mean, first few years as principal, you have no idea what you're doing. And I had no idea what I was doing. I mean, to be honest, I have no idea what I'm doing most of the time now, at 16 years on. But I learned a lot from lots of good people. You know, alongside the teaching and the leading of the college, I wrote a few books along the way, which has expanded the work that I do in theology, mainly about theology and science, although Star Wars is there, and one or two other things. And at the end, in August, by the way, I'm not kind of leaving this world. Philip Plimming at a recent service introduced me and said, and David's only with us until August, as you know, as if he was predicting my death or something like that. And although I look old, I'm not retiring. What I'm going to be doing is heading up a project which we've had in the college for the past 7 or 8 years, which is called Equipping Christian Leadership in Major Science. And I've been leading that on 40% of my time for the past few years, because I'm only 40% as principal of the college. I've got 20% teaching in the department, 40% leading this research project. And we've got funding for another 5 years to allow me to actually spend 100% of my time leading this research project. So it'll still be based here in St. John's, but I won't be around because I don't want to be that kind of shadow in the corridors with my successor, whoever it may be, taking charge. But I'll still be around and I'll still be doing this work in theology and science. So that's a good 45 minutes that you've been very patient about. Do you remember those 5 things that I said right at the beginning? Thank you. So, I think I've learned through all of this that to ask the question, what I would call vocation, that is not perhaps what I'm good at or not what I expect to do, because my career path has been chaotic. But actually, I think what I mean by vocation is how can I make a difference to the world? And my passion has actually been about that over the years. Can I make a difference? And if I get that right, then other things kind of follow, it seems to me. The second is just to accept myself for who I am. I mean, I'm not posh. I don't understand certain things. And I've grown to a place where I'm quite happy with who I am. And the pressure to conform to a group is really strong, isn't it? And, you know, this was even before social media. I think I've got to a place of self-acceptance because ultimately I know that I'm loved. And that seems a bit soppy, but it's been really important. A friend of mine used to get up in the morning, and the first thing he used to say as he got out of bed was, "I am loved." Now, for me, that's been a spiritual experience in terms of being a sense of being loved by God. It's also been a sense of being loved by family, being loved by my wife and children. That's been a huge kind of thing for me in accepting who I am as I am. That's not always the case for everyone. Often that's a rocky road. And so I feel that for me that's been a gift, but that's been important. Third thing is I've been patient with myself at times. I've had to at times say, first year applied mathematics, I haven't a clue what's going on here. Not done any of this. I'm just going to be patient and see whether this is going to work out or not. Give it a bit of time. Fourth, I've really struggled with work-life balance because I think the pressure of coming to university without a background of the university skills, or indeed in my case, some of the mathematical skills that I needed, made me at times overwork. And that's been a pattern for me over decades now. So I have an addiction, and my addiction is being a workaholic, okay? And I've had to get to that stage of recognizing that I'm a workaholic, just as any addict has to do, and then find strategies to try and get a better work-life balance. And so sport for me has been really important. Church for me has been really important. Watching television for me has been really important. Reading has been really important. Listening to music has been really important. Not as extras, but actually part of the person that I am. But it's still something that I struggle with. The temptation just to get the laptop out and to do a bit more. And the final thing is the debt that I owe to community, in that I've told you a few people who I owe a great deal to. Actually, I owe a huge amount to this community as it's renewed every year over the past 16 years. And I think those things are important in moving from a first-generation scholar to principal of this place, which is a huge privilege. Is that all right for this evening? Let's stop there. Now, I don't know whether everyone's really cool. I think you probably are. But I mean, if there's a couple of questions, just for 5 minutes or so, or comments, I'm happy to take them. Or is it a bit like Alan Martin's course on quantum theory? Yeah.
When you finished your PhD, you went to theological college. Did you imagine that you'd end up doing what would end up linking physics and Christianity? Was this something that just...
No, I didn't. And that's a good question, because there is a tendency in certain circles of theological education to say, that was your previous life. Now we're going to teach you a proper thing about theology. And certainly there's a lot of theologians who look down on scientists as, no, that's not, it's not as important as theology. And I remember being sent out to a place in Lowestoft in East Anglia, which is like the end of the earth. And I was on this Ratley train thinking to myself, if I hadn't gone for this theology thing, I'd be probably in the Canary Islands at the moment, doing some observing on a telescope and thinking, is that all behind me? But I think spiritually, for me, as you give up, God always gives you more in return. But also, I think I had some very wise role models, like John Polkinghorne and others, who said, actually, these two things, they're not the same, but they can fit together and be really exciting to fit together. They're not always going to be easy to fit together, but there's a lot of unanswered questions I have about science and theology. But through all of them, I have to say, my excitement, both with science and Christian faith, has always increased. No, I never imagined I'd come back into the academic world. So I felt I was going to be a local church pastor for 40 years, and I would have been very happy with that. And indeed, when I do eventually move on from the academic world, I wouldn't mind going back to be just a local church pastor. It's not just, but to be a local church pastor. So I had no idea. I've learned as I've gone along.
Yeah. Do you think it's become easier to become a first generation scholar?
It's a really good question. I don't know is the honest answer. I think the pressures are different. I think the university is more attentive to the issue, but whether our cultural kind of structures have changed enough, I don't know. I was unusually grey, but there was a group of us who got together, partly because we all had similar background, and it was small enough to know that. But no one ever talked about first generation scholars in those days. People at that first formal would say, "In which school did you come from?" And I would say Greencroft Comprehensive. And even the tutors would go, "Where?" Never mind other students. I think we've moved on a little bit from that. But I think sometimes culture takes a long time to change. I think it's the question for the university is always how are we enriched by diversity? Not just how we support people, but how are we enriched? What gifts do different people from different backgrounds actually bring to the community? And that's a really important thing for me, because I think first generation scholars bring real gifts of insight, which sometimes those of us who've been submerged in this culture don't see. I'll think about that question, thank you.
So with all the life experiences you've had, and in this present situation now, if you could go back to that 19, 20-year-old self, just starting out on that adventure, what would you tell that man?
Don't believe in time travel. Again, that's a fascinating question. I think I'd want to say, try and get the basics right and not worry too much about the big picture. Don't worry about where you might be in 10 years' time. Live life well now. Now, sometimes within religious communities, people get fascinated by, where is God calling you to? And sometimes within educational systems, it's get these A-levels right, get these choices right, because where you want to be. And I think what I'm trying to say to my kids is, live life well now. Do the basic things right. Study faithfully. Enjoy sport and other things. Take time to look after yourself and understand who you are. Take time with friends. Get a good balance. Be kind. Work on what it means to be a human being. And if you get those things good, then actually, in my experience, other things then fall into place. It's when you become obsessed with where you want to be that actually you sometimes forget to live life now. So I think that would be the advice. And, I've made mistakes about that myself. So that would be the advice. Okay. Yeah.
Good evening, David.
Is this about Star Wars?
No.
Okay, good.
My question was, of all your experiences, what would you say you are most proud of that you've accomplished?
That I've published.
That you've accomplished.
Or accomplished. The thing that I'm most thankful for is that Alison Wilkinson actually took courage to marry me. And that Adam and Hannah are kids who've grown up reasonably well. I think if there's one thing that I'm thankful for, it's that. partly because family life is not inevitable. Many of us will know that. It's really risky. It's really tough at times. There are so many different dynamics going on. And when it works out reasonably okay, and it hasn't always been smooth sailing. I mean, when Adam, our first child, was born, someone said to me, "Remember the first 18 years are the worst." And I think that's you learn along the way. But that would be the most thing I'm grateful for. In terms of am I most proud of accomplishing something? Being principal of this place is something that I didn't actually aspire to, but I'm thankful that I've done 16 years and I'm not being thrown out. I've actually been able to do one or two things. But I think that kind of basis of good relationships is the most important thing for me at the end of the day, and something that long after papers in scientific journals or books, once when the books are already in the bargain basement of Amazon, it's the quality of relationships that's the most important thing. Okay, I think everyone's really cold. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I hope that's been all right. I hope that hasn't been wallowing in one story overly. If you see me around, I'm very happy to pick up anything that I said tonight. If you want to have a chat about your own vocation, about your own sense of development as a scholar or as a cricketer, anything that you might want to talk about, I'm very happy to do that. But shall we close it there?
Yeah. Did people tune into it? Yeah, there were 4 people watching. Wow. I know.